Right, okay. Hi, everyone. Good morning. If you could join your seats, we will start right now, if possible. Thanks a lot. So for those who don't know me yet, I'm Jean-Sebastian Batzler from IECP, the Institute for European Climate, Energy and Climate Policy. I had the pleasure to coordinate the Enefirst project, and I will be your host for the second day of the Energy Efficiency Summit. And today, to launch this second day, we have the pleasure and the honor to welcome Eleonora Evi, member of the European Parliament and of the ENVI committee. So sorry for the delay, Eleonora. Thanks a lot for your patience, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Good morning, everyone. So thank you for the invitation and for having organized this event on such a crucial topic, fundamental now more than ever in the tragic context that we are living in. I am sure I don't need to remind such an expert audience why energy efficiency should be the central topic, the central point across all levels of policy making. The benefits of minimizing our energy consumption, saving energy, and ceasing to waste it are so wide-ranging and self-evident that I am astonished that there are still some who don't consider it as utmost priority. Through the maximization of energy efficiency, the EU can substantially reduce its overall greenhouse gas emissions, curb environmental pollution, improve people's health and well-being, create millions of new green jobs, and improve its energy security by cutting its dependence from fossil fuel imports. It should go without saying that we must prioritize energy efficiency and embed the energy efficiency first principle in all policy and investment decisions. But unfortunately, concrete actions in this regard still lag behind. This is why I often refer to energy efficiency as a Cinderella in the EU policy. Indeed, even though the importance of energy efficiency and energy savings is commonly acknowledged in the political debate, there is a huge gap between the theoretical recognition of energy efficiency and the political commitment to substantially foster it. Energy efficiency measures in the EU have contributed to declining energy consumption trends over the years, but current progress is unacceptably slow and far from what it is needed to tap into the full potential of energy savings. Before the pandemic, member states were still off track to meet the 2020 energy efficiency target, which has then been met only because of the lockdowns and emergency restrictions. Having looked at the current ambition for 2030, energy efficiency measures planned at national level in the National Energy and Climate Plans show an aggregated gap of 3% towards the 2030 EU energy efficiency target, whereas the situation looks a bit better as far as the renewable energy target is concerned. Why so? This is the question. Because up until now, the latter has been binding. Simple as that. Therefore, obliging member states to take action on promotion of renewables. Unfortunately, this has not been the case for energy efficiency, and this needs to change now. There cannot be a truly forward-looking and sustainable policy making without energy efficiency at its core. And this is why we need binding targets and ambitious measures to mainstream the energy efficiency first principle across all sectors of the economy. As you know, as part of the Fit for 55 package presented last year, the Commission has proposed to strengthen the Energy Efficiency Directive in light of the higher climate ambition and the climate neutrality goal, finally including a binding EU-wide energy efficiency target for 2030, which is, however, only set at a level of 9% compared to the 2020 reference scenario, which corresponds to 36–39% compared to the previous 2007 scenario. Since the publication of the Green Deal and the Fit for 55 legislative proposal, the geopolitical and economic context has dramatically changed. The heinous war in Ukraine has compelled Europe to readapt its priorities. Although we need no further reasons to speed up the energy transition, Putin's war proved to us once again the senselessness of European dependence on gas imports, as well as on all types of fossil fuels. From Russia alone, the EU, now these data are very well known everywhere, the EU purchased over 40% of all gas consumed, along with 27% of imported oil and 46% of coal. Decades of short-sighted policies and the lack of concrete actions on renewables and energy efficiency no longer allow us to the luxury of hesitation and further procrastination. We must stop financing Putin's atrocities and halt fossil fuels imports from Russia as soon as possible. The solution can no longer be to invest in oil and gas, with diversification of gas supply as a top priority. It is now time to reverse the order of these priorities based on three fundamental steps: energy savings, transition to renewables, and only as a last resort, diversification of supplies, avoiding investing in infrastructure that will condemn us to be dependent on fossil fuels also in the future, and making sure that no investment in new energy imports ever goes to detriment of those in renewable energy and energy efficiency. Reducing energy consumption has enormous potential that is currently unexpressed. Just think that a 1% decrease in energy consumption can reduce Russian gas import by about 2.5% and oil imports by about 3.5%. Through the Repower EU plan presented 2 weeks ago, the European Commission itself has underlined the importance of accelerating actions on energy efficiency, including increasing the 2030 targets from 9 to 13%, to reduce dependence from Russia and stop financing the war indirectly through billion-dollar payments to Putin for fossil imports. However, yet again, the Commission has refrained to fully listen to science and experts that call for a higher level of ambition and to truly put energy efficiency first. Indeed, even more with skyrocketing energy prices that are set to remain high for the next few years, the cost-effective energy savings potential for the EU has increased exponentially, and we cannot settle for anything less than at least 20% by 2030. This is a key fight in my political battle for me and for the Greens group, and I have personally strived to ensure an ambitious position in the European Parliament, in particular as the rapporteur on the recent opinion on the Energy Efficiency Directive for the ENVI committee. I committed myself to strengthen and improve the original Commission's proposal, and I am happy to have been able to convince most political groups in the ENVI committee about the urgency of injecting higher ambition in the EU energy efficiency policy framework. Most importantly, we have been able to increase the proposed EU energy efficiency target to at least 45% compared to the 2007 reference scenario under Article 4, while ensuring national binding contributions to the EU target, with the obligation for member states to calculate those contributions using a fixed formula. In accordance with the increased ambition of the overall target, we also raised the ambition of the national energy savings obligations from 1.5% to 2%, as well as of the sub-target for the public sector. I am also particularly satisfied with what we achieved on the buildings-related provisions, given the pivotal role of this sector must play in reducing energy consumption. Indeed, here we added an additional 3% annual renovation obligation for private buildings providing social infrastructure, such as, for example, hospitals, schools, social housing, etc. And by raising the level of ambition to NZEB, or zero emission buildings, coherently with the ongoing level of the ongoing revision of the EPBD. Specifically, regarding the energy efficiency first principle introduced in the EED for the first time under Article 3 of the recast proposal, we managed to strengthen it with clearer implementation and reporting requirements, mainstreaming it into a number of relevant sectors in the planning, policies, and all investment decisions. I want to stress again, all investment decisions at national, regional, and local levels, thus deleting the limitation only to major investments, which would have otherwise reduced substantially the application of the principle. As a last highlight of the opinion, I would also like to mention the inclusion of the water energy nexus in the relevant provisions, for instance, by extending the concept of energy audits and energy management systems to water use. I think it is extremely important to shed light on these often overlooked aspects, given the strong interdependencies between water and energy. Saving water means saving energy and vice versa, and the revised EED needs to reflect that. Now, I'm going to conclude. It is time to ensure that the level of ambition set in the ENVI opinion is reflected in the final report of the ITRE committee. I am supporting and working closely with our ITRE colleagues to secure a parliament's position that is up to what is needed to fight the climate crisis and enhance Europe's energy security. And we are determined and committed to achieve this. To conclude, I would like once again to thank BPIE and all the partners of the Enefirst and sEEnergies projects for this kind invitation. As key stakeholders and advocates in the energy efficiency sector, what you do is crucial to inform and provide expert input to policy and decision makers. Please keep up the great work and let's all join forces to make sure Europe doesn't miss yet another chance to put forward truly ambitious and forward-looking policies to minimize our energy consumption and accelerate the paths toward climate neutrality. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Eleonora. I think you have perfectly set the scene for this second day and reminding the importance of increasing the ambition and the target, which was also one of the topics of the discussion of yesterday. And today, our objective, as you said, will be to provide some inputs to this process, and especially looking at coming from targets to implementation. You mentioned the gap, the slow progress, etc. So that will be some of the issues that we will address today. So thanks again. I know you have a very busy agenda, so thanks for your time. And we will keep you updated of the results of the day. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Once again. So we will now move to the introduction of the agenda for today. There will be two parts around the lunch break. So for that's not the right presentation, I think. In the morning, we will start by looking at the aspect from the project that come from the quantitative assessments. and the part that were done on the modeling. And we will have then a discussion, a roundtable with experts to see how these assessments can provide information for better decision making and what difficulties are encountered in this process of providing input to decision, adapting the decision process, and so on. And then in the afternoon, we will move to the policy part of the project. And we will first present the results in terms of policy analysis, so the review of the EU framework and the policy approaches that were identified in the project. And then we will have the pleasure to have Veronika Jerokova, who is already here in the room, providing an update about the recent developments in the EU framework for energy efficiency first. Some of them were already briefly mentioned by Eleanor Ivy in our introduction. And at the end, we'll have an open discussion where all of you will be invited to share your views, your comments on these 2 days and on what can be done next to implement further the principle and keep pace with this higher ambition that everybody is pushing for. So you see here the agenda for this morning in the. So I will not repeat myself. I think I will now start. So that's for the afternoon, and we'll have a 1 hour, a bit more than 1 hour lunch break to share more informally, and where you will have also the pleasure to meet coordinators from other projects that came today to join this event. I'm not sure I will be able to list them by heart, but there is the New Trends, MICAT, Referee, Odyssemur, Natalie, if I forget something, you tell me, Era Data, and maybe I'm sorry, the Y project, I see you there. So I hope I've not forgotten anybody. Oops. And to start the day, I will make a very brief introduction about the project, and maybe also starting with the principle, because during these 2 days, we speak a lot about the principle, etc. But what we have also seen in our project, and most probably if you have discussed that with other people, this principle, you might have seen that there may be different ways to interpret what it means, and especially when we go to what it means when we think about implementing the principle. So as a starter is the definition that we developed in the project, so that's not competing with the one that you find and let's say the official one that is in the governance regulation. That's more a complement that was developed within the project to have to be able to highlight the aspects that are closer to implementation and to operational aspects. So we made explicit that there is inside this principle the idea of prioritizing demand-side resources under conditions. So that's not an unconditional prioritization, of course, and that due to this aspect of prioritization, that's a matter of decision principle. And the overall idea is to make that these decision processes are fair, if I make it short. So to be sure that the demand-side resources are considered on a level playing field compared to supply-side resources. And to illustrate what it means in terms of thinking and changing our practices, etc., the first point is it means considering the energy systems as a whole, and that's something that you will see many times during this day, illustrated in different ways. So looking jointly at supply side and demand side resources, their interactions, how they compare, etc. The second point is to think about the societal perspective, which means two main things from our point of view. The one is to consider multiple impacts, and there are, as I mentioned, other projects represented today that deal more specifically with that. And also to consider a long-term perspective, so longer, and especially longer than what an individual investor will consider. In practice, we could also translate the principle in 3 questions, like a checklist of, are you sure that you are implementing the principle in your decision process, planning, etc. So the first one is making sure that demand-side resources are well considered, well assessed, and reviewed. The second one, that they are compared on a fair basis to the supply-side investment options. And the third one is that there is no bias in the decision process, because that's one thing to make a comparison and a nice assessment, but then there is a decision at the end, and we all know that not all decisions are really based on the, I mean, giving the justice to the assessment that are made, even if that's clear that the decision makers are not here just to record an assessment, they are here to make a decision. So, but well, at least they should consider the inputs from the assessments with no bias. And to anticipate some of the comments that we get repeatedly along the project each time we make an event, the principle is not about opposing renewable energy sources and energy efficiency. We fully acknowledge, and that's noted in most of our publication, I think, that both are needed, that they are essential and actually complementary, but the principle is a matter of finding the right balance between both, and also the sequence, because at some point you need to prioritize what you are doing and where you invest the money. And the rest, I think I already said that. And very briefly about the project, I guess most of you already know it, so I can go fast. So the overall objective, that's to develop policy proposal for the implementation of the principle with a focus on buildings and their energy supply. So compared to yesterday, that was the sEEnergies project that cover all the end-use sectors, we are much more focused on buildings, but also considering, of course, how the energy supply systems are connected to them. And for that, there were different steps that you will see during the day. You can see on this slide the team that you will have the chance to meet during the day. They will be on the scene one after the others, except for Aris. Unfortunately, our colleague Eftim Popovsky could not join us this morning, but his work will also be reflected in the presentation in the morning. And there were 2 main parts, one on that's reflecting the structure of the day, so one more on quantitative assessment and modeling, and one part on policy analysis. And that's just to give you a snapshot of the website and to really encourage you to visit it if you have not done already. There are plenty of resources available there. And with that, I will end the introduction and give the floor to my colleague Tim Mendel, who will go for the part on quantitative assessment. Tim, if you want to join, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean-Sebastian. So to begin with, hello everyone. My name is Tim Mendel. I'm a researcher at the Fraunhofer Institute for Systems and Innovation Research in the Department of Energy Policy and Energy Markets. And as Jean-Sebastian just pointed out in the introductory slides, a significant part of the Enefirst project has been dealing with providing quantitative evidence on the energy efficiency first principle for the EU 27. So what we are trying to show in this branch of work is that end-use energy efficiency within the building sector definitely pays off from a systems perspective when you compare to additional investments needed otherwise for generation, for networks, for storage facilities, etc. And within this modeling branch, let's call it, there are basically 2 things that we did. On the one hand, we have a number of so-called case studies in which we look at very particular aspects of the energy system. For example, the trade-off between expanding an existing district heating network versus thermal refurbishments in buildings. Another significant part of this modeling branch is a number of EU scenarios that we developed, which are basically showing the trade-off between saving and supplying energy for the entire EU energy system with a particular focus on the building sector. Perhaps let's let's wait 5 seconds for the title slide. There it is. Great. I'm gonna go right ahead to the structure because it's quite straightforward. So what I will begin with is to give a bit of overview on the background of this modeling exercise that we did. I will then. Oh, that didn't work. Okay, there we go. So after the background, we'll be looking at a bit of methodology. So in particular, the scenarios that we've been dealing with, as well as some underlying assumptions. Finally, obviously, there will be some results. So we'll be showing that basically energy efficiency first definitely pays off from a system perspective if it is consciously pursued in the building sector. But on the other hand, there are also some limitations that I will be drawing some attention to. Finally, there will be some discussions and conclusions with a view to the current debates around the EED and the EPBD and other ongoing initiatives. Doesn't look that elegant as I hoped to, but okay, there we go. So what you see here is basically, if you will, a sophistication of the chart that Jean-Sebastian just showed us. There, laser point as well. There's great. So in a nutshell, as was just said before, energy efficiency first is about solving this trade-off between demand and supply side resources. So it's not only about making this comparison per se, but what is important as well is to have a common, as we call it, decision objective. So we're not basically comparing pears and apples, but one obvious decision objective would be to compare these resource options with a view to climate neutrality by the year 2050. Second step is to compare these resource options, and then third steps is this actual decision rule that the efficiency first principle suggests to prioritize demand side resources whenever they are more cost efficient from a societal viewpoint in particular in meeting these decision objectives. So what did we do in this modeling exercise, in this scenario for the EU 27? Basically, as I've said before, our overall objective was to provide quantitative evidence of the effects of pursuing the energy efficiency first principle in the building sector and energy supply in a transition towards net zero emissions. I think we are all definitely on the same page that energy efficiency is a critical resource when it comes to the conflict or the trade-off against fossil fuel energy supply. So it's absolutely certain that we need energy efficiency in order to reach greenhouse gas neutrality by the year 2050. What is an open issue, however, is how energy efficiency in the building sector performs against renewable energy-based generators, storage, networks, etc. on the supply side, not only with regards to the power system, but also district heating systems and hydrogen supply. So the I'm gonna go shift a little here so that I see my own slides. That's better. No, excuse me. So the research question that we've been dealing with in this modeling exercise is basically what level of end-use energy efficiency in the building sector would basically provide the greatest benefits or least cost. I will get to that in a second, for the EU in achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. These are some key properties of our analysis. So we have an integrated appraisal of demand and supply side resources. We're not only looking at energy efficiency potentials for the building sector from an isolated perspective, but we explicitly investigate the interactions with energy supply that energy efficiency has on the demand side. As I've said, we have a common objective across these scenarios of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050. We are aiming, which is a complicated thing that I'll be talking about in a few minutes. We've been aiming for a societal perspective in this assessment, which, as many of you are aware of, is easier said than done. And finally, which is a critical thing with a view to the current debate, we were not ready yet, or let's say we did not anticipate the recent spikes in energy prices as of this year and last year. These modeling exercises often take several months from data collection to running the models to analyzing everything. That is why our assumptions on energy prices are still are definitely much more conservative than what actually happened on the ground. So that is something that should be borne in mind. Yes. So if I may briefly introduce the modeling team, of course, I've been not working on this alone. We had a couple of partners from the TU Vienna, of which Lukas Kanzel is with us today. Then a couple of people from the Fraunhofer ISI, as well as Efton Popovsky in particular from the IRIS Institute, who's been dealing with the modeling of district heating systems in particular. So some words on the methodology. I don't want to make it too indulgent and too boring when it comes to certain assumptions. Let me just do these animations so that we have the full picture. Right. What you see right here is an overview of the three essential scenarios that we investigated in this model-based assessment. These are labeled low efficiency in buildings, medium efficiency in buildings, and high efficiency in buildings. Initially, we've been choosing these labels carefully. However, in hindsight, we realized that even our low efficiency scenario is definitely much more ambitious than what is currently happening in reality. So we are, as I will be also showing in the following, we are much beyond the EU reference scenario as of 2020, and this will also reflect in the overall results. Across these scenarios, as I've said before, we have the common decision objective of meeting net zero emissions by the year 2050. And then the key differences between the scenarios and how they differ is two things. On one hand, thermal efficiency, that means the energy efficiency of the building shell and the degree or the ambition level of building retrofits. And on the other hand, the ambition levels or appliance efficiency for electrical appliances, lighting, etc. So that means here we go a bit beyond the usual picture of the building sector, which is often restricted to space heating and water heating, which especially in commercial buildings and public buildings is definitely not the only end use that should be taken into account. And as for the other assumptions, I don't want to go too much into detail here. That's something you can, if you're interested, read up in the report. The essence is that we kept these assumptions for energy supply constant across the three scenarios. So that means the only difference in terms of assumptions comes from the demand side, from the building side, which allows us eventually to very distinctly evaluate the effects that end-use energy efficiency has from a system perspective. I've been briefly mentioning the issue of a societal perspective. So as was pointed out in Jean-Sebastian's presentation initially, the energy efficiency first principle ideally is about solving this trade-off between demand and supply from a societal perspective, which includes multiple benefits, but which also has some other ramifications, for example, when it comes to taxes and things like that. What I would like to focus on in this presentation today is the indicator of energy system costs, which is basically the sum of capital costs, fuel costs, operation and maintenance, and some other costs, which are essentially the cost for EU emissions allowances as part of the ETS. In a dedicated follow-up report in the Enefirst project, we're also dealing with a selection of multiple impacts and then see how these multiple impacts change the balance, let's say, or the outcomes of this analysis. But I believe that these results on energy system cost itself will be interesting enough. We have basically four sectors, if you will: buildings, electricity supply, district heating, and hydrogen supply. And we allocate basically all the investments, everything that has to be paid in monetary terms to these different sectors. here's the setup of our models that we use to investigate the scenarios. We use a total of 4 energy system models, or energy demand and supply models, if you will: forecast, invert, Untitled, and net heat. As you can see here from these bluish boxes, they are all basically contributing individual cost components to the overall indicator of energy system cost. There's some data flows between the models, so that means that they're coupled. It's not an integrated model per se. But this overall allows us to have a very detailed picture of the energy system. In particular, the Untitled model is running at an hourly resolution and with a very high spatial resolution, which takes into account the variability of variable renewables, the interactions it has with demand, the operation of storage, to some extent demand response as well. So this provides some good foundation for our work. So before I get to the results, I would like to make you aware of what we call which we gave the catchy term of Scenario Explorer. It is basically an Excel-based tool which contains disaggregated data for every EU country for these 3 scenarios. In my presentation, I'll be focusing on the results for the EU as a whole, but you're warmly invited to check out your country-specific results. What is important to mention is that in this so-called Scenario Explorer, you're unfortunately not able to run dedicated calculations, because as you can imagine, these are quite complex models. Some of them take up to a week or so for a single model run, so it's nothing you want to deal with in your spare time, I suppose. But still, it's worth checking out. It should be available on the Enefirst website. It has an interactive dashboard that you can have some fun with. And yes, so let's get to the interesting stuff. I've said before that all of these 3 scenarios are basically set to reach greenhouse gas neutrality by the year 2050. What you see here are direct emissions from direct combustion in the building sector on the one hand, plus all fuel combustion on the supply side for district heating generation, for electricity generation, and so on. This is not the most interesting finding in itself, because it basically shows that all these 3 scenarios basically reach greenhouse gas neutrality by the year 2050. There are some leftover emissions here, which result from the optimization routines, optimization logic within these models. But basically, if we were to take into account carbon sinks as well, we can make the claim that greenhouse gas neutrality is reached in these 3 scenarios. So, what was not an explicit focus of these scenarios is the carbon budget. So we see that in the definition of policy targets. We often focus on a single year, and that is the same for these models. But just for your information, we also calculated the carbon budget, which, as you can see right here, is has very minor differences as well. So we have a deviation of 2.9% compared to the low efficiency scenario in the medium efficiency scenario. And when we compare high efficiency and low efficiency, we have a difference of 6.4%, which is still manageable, I would say. But overall, this shows that there are different technically viable pathways to reaching net zero emission levels by the year 2050. And as I will be showing in the following, and this is where it gets more interesting, these involve different levels of energy demand and energy supply and different levels of energy system cost. So this is basically, if we were to sum up this in the entire research in 1 or 2 charts, this is one of the critical ones. What you see right here is the difference in energy system cost between the low efficiency scenario on the left-hand side and the medium efficiency scenario on the right-hand side. I will be showing a similar chart for the high efficiency scenario on the next slide. But what we see very nicely here, aside from the fact that there's a very close similarity in aggregate system costs, which is only 0.04% here in these gray bars, is that there's a very distinct trade-off between saving energy on the demand side in buildings and supplying energy on the supply side. So we have additional cost for building retrofits of about 255 billion euros from now until 2050. So this is expressed in cumulative cost right here. And some additional capital cost for more efficient electrical appliances. However, as you can see from these different colored blocks right here, is that this leads to savings on the one hand for heating systems. So you need smaller heat pumps, for example, in buildings, which save some costs, but also for fuel costs in buildings. That means biomass, coal. What else do we have? Fuel oil. But here, when it comes to distinct supply side resources, district heating, electricity supply, but also hydrogen supply, we also see these changes in energy system costs. So this shows very nicely the trade-off between these two poles. Overall, we can say here that enhanced energy efficiency standards in buildings, as represented by the medium efficiency, are almost equivalent in energy system cost to a scenario with what did I write here? No, basically these the low efficiency scenario and the medium efficiency scenario are pretty much equivalent when it comes to energy system costs. So we have a cost benefit ratio of 97.3%. So there's only a small part of these additional capital costs for retrofits and efficient appliances that is not offset by savings in energy supply. We see a more distinct picture when we look at the high efficiency scenario, if the pointer allows me to. So again, we have the low efficiency scenario on the left-hand side and the high efficiency scenario on the right-hand side. As I will be showing in the next slide, you're probably wondering what is low efficiency, what is high efficiency. These are very abstract terms. But for the moment, what we see is that the additional capital cost, in particular for these building retrofits, are much higher in this high efficiency scenario. But they also lead again to savings for energy supply. This time, the cost benefit ratio that was calculated here is 82.5%, which means that solely based on this indicator of energy system cost, the high efficiency scenario would not be cost effective, which is a bold claim because there are multiple impacts that are not taken into account. We did not take into account the recent spikes in energy prices. So this results should definitely be interpreted with caution, which I will get back to later. Again, which is interesting as well, we have a very nice, very close similarity in aggregate energy system costs. So over the period of from 2020 till 2050, we'll have cost from 15.6 trillion euros to 15.8 trillion euros approximately, even though the ambition levels for end-use energy efficiency in these two scenarios are very much different. So overall, no, that was the wrong button. What's going on? Excuse me. It's not as easy as I thought. Overall key message, highly ambitious performance standards for building efficiency does not fully pay off in terms of energy system cost. That was the key point I wanted to make. Let's move on. Yes, so let's illustrate more what these three scenarios entail for the building sector. Right here, in this table, you see a comparison between these three scenarios, low efficiency, medium, and high efficiency. We see that building energy demand for space heating, water heating, electrical appliances, and basically everything that happens within the buildings reduces significantly between these scenarios. Energy savings compared to 2020 levels are 21% approximately for low efficiency, 30% and 35% respectively for medium efficiency and high efficiency. To give you some orientation, according to the EU reference scenario, the most recent one of 2020, the reduction from 2050 to 2050, excuse me, from 2050 to 2020 levels is about 10%. So even, as I've said previously, in the low efficiency scenario, we're already much beyond the ambition of the EU reference scenario, which is important to point out since we chose this term of low efficiency scenario, which we could have done otherwise in hindsight, but here we are. What you also see here is the building renovation rate, which is, many of you are probably aware of that there are different definitions of renovation rates, and it's always hard to immediately compare them. Our renovation rates are defined in terms of renovated building surface. So basically, if a window is refurbished in a building or so, this is only a certain share of the overall building surface, which then accumulates in this indicator or in this metric of renovation rates. Let's illustrate things a bit more. So again, this right here is final energy demand by end use, this time shown in the form of a chart. We've seen these reductions before in the table. I've mentioned the Primes 2020 scenario, or the EU reference scenario, if you will, with a 10.4 reduction, 10.4% reduction from 2020 versus 2020, from 2050 versus 2020 levels. We can see that space heating remains obviously still the biggest end use in 2050. But key message, as I've touched upon already, even in the low efficiency scenario, substantial energy reductions are needed to contribute to net zero emission levels by the year 2050. This allows us to put these numbers more into perspective. What you see right here is a relation of our numbers for final energy demand to the energy efficiency target set out in the Energy Efficiency Directive. Here we did not yet take into account the Commission proposal as part of the Repower package, Repower EU package. But we did relate our numbers to what is currently in place, which is the target of the 2018 EED amendment, which corresponds to 32.5% reduction in final energy demand versus the Primes 27 baseline in the year 2030. We've had the last year's Commission proposal for a recast of the EED with approximately 37.2% reduction. And then, as you can see here at the bottom end, this is how our scenarios basically relate to these targets. So in the low efficiency scenario, we would have approximately a 34.8% reduction, etc. What's critical to emphasize here is that we did not explicitly model the industry sector and the transport sector. They do play a role in the modeling because we need a whole system perspective, but the effect that you can see right here also stems to a large part from the REC max scenario as part of the impact assessment for the 2021 Commission proposal for the EED recast. But still, this gives some perspective overall. What we see right here are heating and cooling technologies in buildings. On the left-hand side, in terms of energy and terawatt hours, and on the right-hand side, in terms of nominal capacities. What is most obvious, what we've seen before in the previous chart, is that there are substantial reductions in energy demand for heating. We have a share of 38 to 40% of heat pumps and heat demand in 2050. And heating demand also reflects in technology capacities. So when we compare, for example, the low efficiency scenario to the high efficiency scenario in the year 2050, we can very nicely see these differences in the capacities of individual heat pumps that are needed on site in buildings. So overall, what we see here is that ambitious building performance levels result in substantial reductions in final energy demand for heating, as well as the nominal capacities of heating technologies, which then, of course, has implications for energy system cost. Let's have a look at what happens on the supply side in these scenarios. I'm going to go briefly through electricity supply, district heating supply, and hydrogen supply in the following. We see large differences in gross electricity generation. What is important as well is that there are differences in installed generation capacities in the year 2050. This also has effects on cross-border transmission network capacities. Cumulative cost for electricity supply alone reduces as well across these scenarios. So I would say in particular, these findings for installed capacities have very important implications for For example, for planning as part of the 10E regulation, how should network planning be conducted with a view to taking into account demand-side resources, and how this can reduce the need for supply-side network capacities. Then, of course, you can continue the story when it comes to power generators, which, of course, operate in a liberalized market-based or competition-based system. But the idea of energy efficiency first also has to play a role there for sure. But let's look at some more illustrative charts instead of these naked numbers. This right here is a load duration curve for total electricity supply for these three scenarios. So a load duration curve is basically a way to arrange a load curve in descending order, which gives a nice view of minimum load that is occurring in the energy system, maximum load. And we can see very nicely here in this chart that as a result of these end-use energy efficiency ambitions in the building sector, we see a very explicit decline in peak load, in electrical peak load in the year 2050. So this, of course, then has ramifications for the amount of power capacities needed, etc., of network capacities, as I've just mentioned. Right here, these are the installed capacities on the left-hand side for variable renewable generators, and on the right-hand side for dispatchable generators. What we see very nicely, for example, here is that in some of these scenarios, there's no need to exploit the entire potential for wind power, which is here, this purple one, and also for rooftop PV and field PV. So this means in practice, since we are realizing now that deploying supply-side resources or power generators or renewable power generation is easier said than done. It is good to know that energy efficiency on the demand side can definitely reduce the need for these renewable power generators on the supply side. Of course, when we look at the overall planning and approval procedures in certain countries for power generators, this is a very critical information to bear in mind, that we can perhaps achieve targets faster if the demand side is thoroughly taken into account in the overall planning process. On the right-hand side, with a view to these dispatchable generators, we can see, for example, that hydrogen, which is here, these bluish bars, or the need for hydrogen power plants is reduced as well. Also, we have some implications for battery storage, but I would suggest that we instead have a look at this. So it's a similar picture, basically. You get the gist of it, I suppose. We have these implications as well for electricity generation. Again, all of these generators obviously do not need to supply as much to serve the entire energy system. And but overall, we can see that electricity supply for net zero emissions requires massive generation from variable renewables. So this is certain across all of these three scenarios. We cannot go without this massive deployment. But it's which again leads us to the topic of efficiency first. This implicit trade-off. We don't want to call it a conflict or anything between saving and supplying energy, but still, from an economic perspective, there's this trade-off, and it should be made explicit as much as possible. I'm going to make it short on this slide. This is basically a slightly different form of showing these previous results on generation. So what we see here is a winter day on the 15th of February for 2050. Of course, we don't know exactly the weather for that day or the overall system constraints or system conditions. But our models allow us to make these simulations, and we're going to have to wait for 30 years to see if that turns out the way it's depicted here. But we also see here the slight difference in hourly electricity generation when we compare low efficiency, medium efficiency, and high efficiency. And also at the bottom here in these light blue blocks, we have some implications as well for what is centralized heat pumps in district heating systems, which require electricity, and heat pumps in buildings. So overall, all of these numbers also have implications at an hourly system operation level. Very briefly, some key insights on district heating supply as another important branch of energy supply. Again, the picture is similar to electricity supply. In response to these ambitious end-use energy efficiency standards in the building sector, we reduce the need for, on the one hand, for generation, which is obvious, but also on the other hand, for the installed capacities for different district heating generation technologies. Also, as a result, the heat network length decreases across these scenarios, and also the cost for district heating systems. I'm going to skip this slide, I think. Here again is a similar picture. On the left-hand side, variable renewables, which are essentially geothermal and solar thermal energy in district heating systems in 2050. What we were not capable of doing is to take into account waste heat as an important resource options in district heating systems, which would require some more sophisticated modeling, and especially some coupling to an industry sector model that basically provides the potentials for waste heat from different applications. But we have these two technologies covered, geothermal and solar thermal. And then when it comes to dispatchable generators, which is interesting, here there's a reduced need for large-scale heat pumps in district heating systems, and also for hydrogen boilers, which are again these blue blocks right here. I'm going to skip district heating generation because it's basically confirms what I previously said: more energy efficiency, less supply needed. It's not the most critical finding in itself. But perhaps here, when it comes to hourly system operation, we see a clearer picture compared to the electricity system. So district heating demand is reduced significantly across these scenarios, but there remains some demand on one hand in buildings, but on the other hand also in the industry sector. But we can see very nicely that in response to reduced demand, which is the gray block right here, we need much less generation on this winter day of the 15th of February, again in 2050, from hydrogen boilers, but also from heat storage. Solar thermal applications are present in all the three scenarios because the potentials are basically exploited and used as much as possible. And also centralized heat pumps need to operate less in these scenarios. Finally, here I'm not going to show dedicated charts on hydrogen supply because what we assumed in these scenarios is that heating energy demand within buildings is not significantly served by direct usage of hydrogen, which, as we know from many previous studies, is definitely not an attractive option to take into account in order to decarbonize the building sector. However, our findings or our numbers have ramifications for how hydrogen is used on a supply side. In particular, as I've shown before, it's used, for example, in hydrogen boilers in district heating systems, but also in dedicated hydrogen power plants in the electricity system. So even though we don't have this explicit focus on hydrogen in buildings, it still has these effects on the supply side, because both electricity and district heating need full decarbonization by 2050, according to these scenarios. What is interesting, for example, is that we have, again, reduced electrolyzer capacity across these scenarios. This also goes for synthetic methane generation, which can be used as a synthetic hydrocarbon or synthetic fuel. But again, you're warmly invited to check out I think the chapter on hydrogen is about 3 pages or so in the report. It's a quick read if you're interested in that. So these have been some very diverse numbers, and I hope that I haven't been running through them too quickly. If you have any questions on that, please let me know, then we can delve into particular numbers more in detail. What I would like to go over now is what we can actually derive from these rather abstract numbers. So we've been talking about low efficiency, high efficiency scenarios. This is I've touched upon the potential or possible targets for revision of the energy efficiency directive. But what I would like to do first is to put things into perspective. This right here is basically a reformulation of this waterfall chart that I've shown in the very beginning. So the trade-off basically between saving energy and supplying energy. Everything that is above the x-axis basically represents additional cost compared to the low efficiency scenario as a reference point here. So these are obviously the costs for building retrofits and for electrical appliances. Here in the middle, you see the overall annual differential costs. So the medium efficiency scenario compared to low efficiency would cost about 200 million euros more than the low efficiency scenario for the entire EU 27, which I will be arguing in the following is definitely not much. And also for the high efficiency scenario, there's an additional cost of 3.8 billion euros. This time, again, when you put it into perspective, it's not a big deal. In turn, this leads to very immediate cost reductions for district heating supply, for electricity supply, and to some extent for hydrogen supply on the demand side. So this is maybe an important way to depict this principle of energy efficiency first and the trade-off that it entails between demand and supply side resources. So here are some overall conclusions that we can draw from this. Basically, end-use energy efficiency or end-use energy efficiency in buildings, because this has been our focus, is a critical resource with a view to economically or to reaching an economically cost-efficient transition to net zero emissions by 2050. What we've seen is that there's a very close similarity in system cost between the medium efficiency and the low efficiency scenario, from which we can infer that if we were to go below the low efficiency scenario, we're definitely going to have additional cost from a system perspective for the EU as a whole. So this low efficiency scenario, from our perspective, should be seen as the very bottom of possible ambition levels for end-use energy efficiency in buildings. Everything below will lead to, on the one hand, to reduce to significant amount of additional energy system cost. But on the other hand, which has been so far beyond the scope of this presentation, to multiple benefits or multiple impacts that are not exploited when it comes to energy efficiency. So we definitely support seeing the medium efficiency scenario as something that can be supported even though the difference was small. And we also need to take into account the effect of uncertainties and the higher energy prices that we are observing now. What we also see is that the ongoing debate around efficiency first provides significant added value in a way that the principle makes explicit this trade-off between saving energy and supplying energy. So as demonstrated by the scenarios, end-use energy efficiency in buildings clearly reduces the need for electricity district heating and also hydrogen infrastructures on the supply side, not only generators, but also storage, also networks, in transitioning to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. What we also see is that there's, this is a bit of interpretation and something that goes beyond this mere indicator of energy system cost, is that we see ample reason to support ambition levels for energy efficiency that are beyond the low efficiency scenario. I've already made a case for the medium efficiency scenario as something to be supported because it's very close and it's definitely in the range of uncertainty. But there are also very good reasons to support the ambition level of the high efficiency scenario, which was renovation rates of 1.7%, a reduction of more than 25% in final energy demand compared to current levels, and more. Here we put these numbers a little bit into perspective. So to illustrate the additional cost for high efficiency versus low efficiency for the entire EU 27 was about 3.8 billion euros per year. So this corresponds to less than 0.03% of the EU's GDP. It's also linking to the current debate. It's 1.4% of the net import value of fossil fuels. It's 2.5% of the EU budget. Of course, this is something that wouldn't be funded on the grounds of EU budget, but still, it gives an idea. Or it's approximately €8.50 per EU citizen and year. So these are definitely some good reasons to think beyond these mere numbers of energy system cost. And overall, which links to the later presentations that we have today, in these optimization techniques that we essentially use for modeling these scenarios, we did not have the means to model dedicated policy instruments for all these sectors. As you can imagine, achieving greenhouse gas neutrality by 2050 and also having this particular focus on end-use energy efficiency in buildings requires a very broad policy response that goes beyond sectors, which includes carbon pricing, minimum energy performance standards, information measures, and much more. This is something that we'll be dealing with in depth later. Before I conclude, I would like to raise some attention to why these results should be interpreted with a pinch of caution. On the one hand, what we are most aware of, we have uncertainties, not only when it comes to energy prices, but also with regards to technologies. What is interesting now is that we have this very significant debate on the recent spike in energy prices. But on the other hand, you can argue that this already happened before in the 2007 economic crisis, before the COVID pandemic hit, and so on. And I would suppose it's definitely not the last time that something like this will happen in a long-term perspective or over the next 30 years up until 2050. So this definitely raises the need for dedicated sensitivity analysis in such modeling exercises. On the other hand, sensitivity analysis has some limitations, because if we were to take into account all the uncertainties that are around in the energy system, we don't get a clear picture anymore, or we don't manage to have a clear support for certain decisions, because basically all the different pathways will be somewhat overlapping. So there will be confidence intervals that are going up and down, and then in the end we don't know really which of these pathways are preferable from the current situation. So from a scientific perspective, sensitivity analysis is critical to make these uncertainties tangible, but we should also bear in mind the limitations that this has in order to clarify the picture with a view to these very long-term transitions that we are looking at. Second, there's some minor limitations in the modeling capabilities that we used. We did take into account direct rebound effects, for example, building users raising the effective indoor temperature in buildings in response to the thermal retrofits. But as you know, rebound effects go beyond that. Indirect rebound effects, so people purchasing more of other goods because they're saving money. We also have economy-wide rebound effects. So for example, or macroeconomic rebound effects, if you want to call them like that. So that means if we have a significantly reduced amount of energy demand for natural gas, let's say, this increases, this decreases the price of natural gas, which then again, where ideally you would make the loop, has some implications for energy demand again. So it's feedback between demand and supply that is not fully taken into account here. When we model a single building or so, we don't need these elasticities or so from an economic perspective. But since we're modeling an entire continent here, it's important to bear in mind these feedbacks. The role of demand response and energy sufficiency is not explicit in these scenarios, and they have great potential to make a further case for energy efficiency first. We do have some modeling logic involved that deals with demand response for heat pumps. But it's basically limited to that. So if we were to take into account all the applications that are demand response ready, I'm pretty sure that we would have some very interesting insights on for example, on the amount of network capacity needed, on the amount of generation capacities, etc. And the same goes for energy sufficiency. The problem, or let's call it a challenge about integrating energy sufficiency in such cost-benefit analysis is that we need to attach a monetary value to the activity or the energy service that a person is foregoing in order to save on energy. One might argue that utilities stay stable, so no matter if I use I don't know, my electric clothes dryer or clothesline that I hang outside, But this is definitely something for further research in order to provide further support for the energy efficiency first principle from a modeling perspective. And finally, last item, some conceptual issues. You might have noticed that this indicator of energy system cost that we put a lot of emphasis on in this analysis is limited basically to monetary expenses, so to capital costs, fuel costs, operation and maintenance costs, etc., which neglects or omits the variety of multiple impacts that are present in the system. That is quite obvious. It starts with improvements in indoor comfort, which could be quantified and even monetized. It continues with reduced air pollution, for example. There are macroeconomic employment effects that should be taken into account. And this is still a very interesting field of research of how these various multiple impacts can be integrated in such a, which is basically a cost benefit analysis framework that we used in this study. That is why I'm going to skip this slide because I just talked about that qualitatively. That is why in a dedicated follow-up report, which you can also retrieve from the Enefirst website, we are looking at, on the one hand, the conceptual background, why energy efficiency first and multiple impacts are basically two sides of the same coin. We see how, or we consider how different impacts can be aggregated to inform decisions in different venues. So, for example, in this study, we use a CBA type framework, whereas obviously other decision support frameworks are could be taken into account or should be taken into account as alternatives. For example, multi-criteria analysis is definitely something that is relevant, especially at a local level, because cost-benefit analysis will probably be much too abstract in such a framework. But finally, what we also do in this report is to quantify selected multiple impacts and to integrate them into this analysis right here. What we look at is air pollution impacts and indoor comfort, which already significantly alters the outcomes and the conclusions that can be drawn from this analysis. So with that being said, I would like to thank you for your attention. And I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim, for this quite comprehensive view of the quantitative assessment part of the project. So we have now time for some questions or comments on these results or scenarios. And maybe, and before you take the mic, don't forget to quickly say your name and affiliation. That will be very nice for the participants following online because I don't see you directly. And maybe we start with Vlasis.
Thank you very much. I'm Vlasis Economou from ICP. So one question to that. First of all, it's nice you mentioned about the role of the MBs, of the multiple benefits. And would you expect to change a lot if you would take the MBs as cost efficiency ratio, especially for the high efficiency scenarios? And the second one, parallel to that, is that now that we have all this crisis part and we think a bit short term, does the cost efficiency ratio change if we take into account the 2030 period? Because now we saw the cumulative, in all the cumulative aspects. Would it change a lot if we just focus on the 2030 with a high, low, medium?
Thank you for your questions. So about your first question, what we see in this follow-up report on multiple impacts is on the one hand that it's very difficult to integrate each and every relevant multiple impact into a cost-benefit type of framework. It's pretty much straightforward. For example, when you factor in the cost of air pollution, there are cost rates, there are emissions. That's something that is easily tangible and which can be readily integrated in such a framework. But things get more complicated, for example, when looking at aggregate employment effects, which is one thing where I would see some need to also look at that from a theoretical economic perspective, how that actually fits into cost-benefit analysis, because it's very tempting to add everything up and then to compare this difference between costs and benefits. But as was also shown in particular in the Combi project a few years ago, is that there's various overlaps between these multiple impacts. And if you do not take into account these overlaps, you end up with basically a significant overestimation of these multiple impacts in monetary terms. So this is a great challenge. About your second question, the 2030 perspective, I'm trying to remember some numbers that I looked at a while ago. And besides in this scenario explorer tool, you can also change the target year and then see how the numbers react. But from what I remember, these building retrofits are basically happening at a very early stage in this optimization logic, which leads to very high capital costs in the period from now to 2030, which by 2030 are not offset by savings in energy supply. This takes until 2040 and even longer, and it's as we've seen in the final numbers, it's a very close call between these scenarios. So what I would derive from this is that it does take this long-term perspective in order to make this case for building retrofits. And as we all know, the payback times for such measures are not short, right? And it takes some while to recap these costs. Sorry.
I mean, because this would influence very much the whole discussion about the MEPS, the minimum energy performance standards. That's what I mean. That's what the basic of the question. So if we see that by 2030, it doesn't pay off yet at all, yeah, it changed a lot quite the debate on whether how these things all can be applicable or not. Yeah.
Hi, team. Yes. I'm Bianca Shoei-Terani from RTE, the French TSO. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I had a question on how you built your scenarios. I'm not sure I got it right about the low and high efficiency levels. So from what I got, you told us that the low efficiency scenario is still more efficiency than what is happening right now or in the past years. But the high efficiency scenario is not as much as the EU objectives. Is that right? Or not as high as the EU objectives? And regardless, I was wondering why you chose this range of ambitions and in terms of the story that you wanted to tell with these scenarios.
Mm-hmm. So first things first, thank you for the question. Basically, what we did in order to come up with these scenarios is not to have predefined renovation rates or predefined reductions in final energy demand that we wanted to achieve, but instead the model that we use for building energy demand for space heating and water heating invert, it's an optimization model. So that means in these optimization models you have lower ends or lower and upper boundaries for building retrofits and other measures. And then the model attempts to find a least cost solution within these constraints in order to find, which in our case was the target of net zero emissions by 2050. I fully agree that even the high efficiency scenario that we presented here today might be below the ambition levels that are now currently under discussion. I'm saying might because I'm not aware of the exact differences between the currently discussed ambition levels and what is, for example, in the 2021 impact assessment for the EED when it comes to the industry and the transportation sectors. I've briefly touched upon that before, that it doesn't go without trouble to translate these savings numbers into the energy efficiency target set out in the EED. But still, perhaps I would also hand over to Lucas if you have additional thoughts on that, because he's been much more involved in the building modeling than I have.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Lucas Kranzl, TU Wien. I mean, I agree with everything that you said, Tim. I just wanted to also maybe it was a bit of misunderstanding that I wouldn't agree that the high efficiency scenario is definitely not in line with current discussions and ambition levels and targets. It's still not so clear, as you said, Tim, no? Because the ambition levels in the building sector are not 100% defined from the overall direction regarding what is I said also in the renovation wave, like doubling of the renovation rate and renovation depths. I have the feeling that these discussions of the renovation wave and also the recast EPBD is between our medium and the high efficiency scenario.
Hello, and thank you for the presentation. My name is Andrei David Korberg, and I'm from Aalborg University, the team that did the modeling in sEEnergies, actually, for the other project. I have two questions. First question is about this trade-off between heat supply and heat savings. You mentioned it at the beginning, but I'm not sure if I observed it. Like, in our modeling, we see that the more heat savings we implement makes the system more expensive. So at some point, it makes more sense to supply more heat rather than invest in more savings. And I'm not sure if I noticed that in your scenarios. And maybe we can say more about it. And my second question is about the choice of having hydrogen boilers in district heating. And well, hydrogen, I assume it's green hydrogen, or I don't know what hydrogen it is, but how does that fit with the energy efficiency first principle of burning hydrogen for heating purposes?
Thank you, Andre. About your first question, so this trade-off between heat supply and heat demand, I think what is a blind spot in our analysis is how profitable these developments in the energy system are for individual district heating networks in practice. So as I've talked about, so these are optimization models. So they operate at a pretty much at a high level, and they don't look at the individual business rationale from a power generator or from an individual district heating system operator or owner. So if I do remember correctly, what we do see across the scenarios is that we have decreasing heat densities from low efficiency to high efficiency, which means that the profitability of district heating supply, especially in a low efficiency scenario, might be jeopardized for certain systems. Our models are spatially resoluted, but they don't model each and every district heating system in isolation. So there are some blind spots that would need dedicated analysis at a local level, which is something that we do in follow-up case studies in the Enefirst report, in the dedicated report that is coming up. So this explicit trade-off between saving and supplying energy for district heating systems. Right. Would you be so kind to briefly recap the second question that you had? I should have taken notes. Sorry.
Yeah, the second question is about the hydrogen boiler. So
yeah, exactly.
In the sEEnergies project, we found out that hydrogen should be limited to the hard to abate sectors like industry and aviation and maritime transport. So we have, for example, in heating, we don't use hydrogen in the sEEnergies project, but we have a lot of heat pumps and waste heat. And you mentioned you don't have waste heat in your models. You didn't model that, but still, why did you choose to have hydrogen boilers in this case?
Well, to begin with, we didn't choose to have these hydrogen boilers. This is basically the result of a cost optimization routine in these models. So the model tries to find the least cost solution, taking into account all the interactions with electricity supply, the availability of variable renewables, residual loads, and how this can be utilized, and then comes up with these numbers. Perhaps you remember this one chart of hourly system operation for district heating systems, in which you saw a very large block of hydrogen supply. Now I realize that this chart might have been misleading because it shows a day with very high peak demand in the middle of February, which is I think it was even the coldest day that we model in this typical weather year. So this is an extraordinary situation where basically all supply or heat supply capacities need to come in order to cover thermal load, which may have led to this large chunk of hydrogen that you saw there. I would have shown the other slide now if it was still there, but I can also mention it. Like when we look at the numbers for overall heat generation in terawatt hour terms for the entire EU 27, the share of hydrogen is actually not that big. It's definitely used at a very low capacity factor, so it's only running a couple of, let it be 100 hours per year or so in these scenarios, and only for these extraordinary purposes. But overall, it's definitely arguable whether, if we were to take into account waste heat options, if that could be a reasonable substitute for these hydrogen boilers. But since we're doing a cross-system optimization, we also take into account what's happening in the industry sector and the transportation sector. I do still see some scope based on these numbers that hydrogen could be playing a role, but I wouldn't over-interpret these, especially the single chart on hourly operation that we've seen. But it would be definitely interesting to compare different studies on how they relate to the deployment of hydrogen boilers in particular in district heating systems, and whether that's likely to have a large share in future.
Okay, thanks a lot, Tim. We take a last question and then we go to the roundtable. So I will. Meanwhile, during the question, I will set up the scene and I invite the panelists to join. Thanks.
Yes.
And please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Good morning. Philippe Garec from GRDS, the French gas DSO. I have a question about biomethane. I know you've launched your study before the report. We set a target of 35 BCM. So there is a large potential of biomethane in Europe, about 1,200 to 1,600 according to EBA and IEA. Biomethane is very cost effective when considered seasonal storage. And it's easy to combine with, for example, a hybrid heat pump or cogeneration to create a demand side capacity. Now, considering this, if you were to integrate biomethane in your model, what do you think will be the effect? Will that displace hydrogen use or bring down the cost?
Thank you, Philippe, for that question. So if I got your question correctly, you're wondering what would happen if we were to take into account seasonal heat storage and heat pumps in buildings, right? And how
it's a hybrid heat pumps in buildings using biomethane.
That's a good question. It depends, obviously, a lot on the price of biomethane, and then whether that would be a feasible option. Thermal energy storage or seasonal energy storage is taken into account in these numbers. But Lucas, if I remember correctly, we've had a similar discussion on these hybrid heat pumps a few weeks ago, and
yes. So thanks for the question. For me, it's basically again the same. Goes in a bit in a similar direction as we had before. This comment or question of where to use hydrogen in the overall economy, and I know that probably the argument is why the heat pumps, the efficiency could be increased, but in the end, for me, it's still the question: why then to use the biomethane the whole years in the decentral heat pumps, where we would actually need it only for the seasonal storage purpose. And so this is the reason why also in our models it doesn't result in lowest cost, let's say. Huh?
Yeah, the idea is because it's very easy and cheap to store for seasonal needs, because it costs hardly nothing to store, because they can use all the existing infrastructure which are already set for methane.
Yeah, but still, for me, the question is whether we won't need the biomethane potentials more urgently in other sectors, industry, and maybe peak load power generation.
Yeah, I think that would require some investigation, but according to our study, is more interesting to use it in buildings for seasonal heating. And we don't need the whole of it. We need only a part of it. Thank you. But I will be interested in pursuing this exchange later on, if you don't mind.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments and opening this discussion. This can continue over lunch. Now we move to the next session, the roundtable, and 5 experts here today that I will let Wolfgang introduce. One is online, so that's why we have the screen in between. So Wolfgang, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for this, Tim, for this very interesting presentation of results. In this panel session, we are going to focus on how quantitative assessments, as we have seen in the previous presentation, can inform the trade-off between energy efficiency, renewables, and electrification in order to meet carbon neutrality in buildings. My name is Wolfgang Eichhammer. I'm with the Fraunhofer Institute for Systems and Innovation Research in Karlsruhe, Germany. We have 5 panelists, 4 present here, 1 online, and I will introduce the panelists for time reason when we come to the questions. And let's first have an individual interaction with the panelists, and I would start with Brian. Brian Fatmatison, he is a professor at Aalborg University, and we heard yesterday a lot about the sEEnergies project. A major focus of the sEEnergy project is the assessment of the energy efficiency potentials, notably on demand and supply side, which is an essential prerequisite to know which options are available, under which conditions, and at which cost. So I would like to start this roundtable with you on the assessment of these potentials with the following questions. What has been improved from your perspective in the assessment of energy efficiency potentials, which are an essential ingredient to the energy efficiency first principle, and what challenges remain? Brian, you have a microphone, or otherwise someone took it? Okay.
Well, what I think is that through these projects, we're able to quantify not only in one sector, but in several sectors. This is what we've tried to do in the sEEnergies project. I think there's a need to enhance the understanding more broadly of energy efficiency. We are somewhat in a bubble here, and I think the more we can spread the word about how important this is, the better. What we try to do is to look at industry, transport, and buildings, where traditionally maybe there's a lot of focus on buildings, which also is extremely important for very good reasons, because the energy demand there is so high. But we can also identify very big and cost-effective energy efficiency measures in industry and in transport. Now, when we try to compare these across, it also becomes clear that they actually stand alone good ideas to do in each sectors. So you can't say we should prioritize this over this. You can actually say we actually have to do both this and also that and also this. And the reason is, of course, that if we don't have any ambition on all of the sectors, we will continue doing business as usual investments. And this is exactly what we have to get out of and trade off our fuel consumption with investments in energy efficiency. Now, if I can just comment also on the levels of energy efficiency that were also in the discussions before. So we believe that the ambition in the Fit for 55 is rather large compared to what we think is realistic to reach, not because reach these 14% energy efficiency in 2030, but we do believe there's much too short time to be able to reach that. So we think that should be a lower target, which we're immediately saying that people will think I'm against the energy efficiency, which I'm really not. On the other hand, I think there needs to be more focus on the supply side, where we try to also assess the different supply sides. Maybe we can come back to that. But just like one more comment on the goals, because we discussed that also before. You had this low efficiency, medium and high efficiency scenarios here in the Enefirst project, and we end up somewhere around 35% as well in 2050. But I'll just like to remind you that this is lower than what is in the 1.5 tech scenario from the Commission. We sort of try to dismantle this because it's somewhat unclear sometimes what the end demand actually is in buildings. But doing that, we found that here they're closer to maybe 45%, 42%, and that is much too high. And that, I believe, has to be corrected because you cannot decrease that much energy efficiency in the end use.
Brian, now you are provoking the moderator, and that's not a good thing to do, nevertheless.
But then you have to remember you're the moderator.
Nevertheless, bracket. You know, yesterday I cited I'm from Germany, and I cited our own energy efficiency efforts for 2020, and we missed our national energy efficiency targets, if we correct for COVID, roughly by half. And this is about the equivalent of Russian gas imports to Germany. So we would have a little bit of a problem less if we would have managed our targets earlier. Now, let me use a proverb. The best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago, because then we would have now a nice tree. And in the absence of having planted the tree, the best point in time is still to plant the tree today, rather than waiting another 5 to 10 years or reducing our targets. But now I'm closing the bracket in order to take up my role as a moderator once again. So coming back to the questions about the potentials and how important in your study was it to consider the interaction between energy demand and supply? We saw this prominent trade-off here in the presentation of Tim, and I remember yesterday also we talked a lot about district heating. I mean, it's a special context, but would like to get your reaction on these interaction from your sEEnergies perspective.
Yeah, so we regard this dynamic as important. I think if you work in energy efficiency, you have to be able to have some good answers on the balance between the supply and demand side. There are many different countries in Europe, and there are many different debates, but there are countries in Europe where the debate is that we don't have to do energy savings because we have enough renewables. So you actually have to be also able to sort of have a debate about this. And this is where we actually went to the level of savings in the 1.5 tech scenario in the long term and found this is a much too much. We will have to have very substantial changes in existing houses to an unrealistic level, and there we found this around 30%. But then we also looked, of course, at the supply system, and it matters in the supply system what you have. We didn't even analyze gas for absorption heat pumps. We didn't even analyze hydrogen for heating. It's not an option. It's not an option, but we analyzed rather thoroughly district heating, high low temperature, heat pumps, geothermal, all of the different kind of supplies that we have, and we find that it's a good idea to have 50 or 55% district heating in Europe, and then the rest should predominantly be heat pump. Now there'll be areas where you have a lot of biomass that you would like to use local resources, but actually it would be a very good idea not to do that. So we find that, and if we don't do that, then we also find that the peaks on the power plant side and the energy, the security of supply actually is a bit in danger if we have a one-string system with a lot of electric heating.
Thanks a lot, Brian, for these remarks. I would like to move on to our second panelist. In fact, Mrs. Barbara Schloman from Fraunhofer ISI, who is coordinating the MECAT project on multiple benefits, she couldn't make it yesterday for reasons of the strike which we had here in Belgium. And fortunately, we have a replacement with Frederick Berger, also from Fraunhofer ISI, who is holding up the flag in the MICAT project on the multiple benefits. And we heard in the presentation from Tim on his last slide how important it is to reflect further on this part, which adds up to the system costs perspective. So I would like to ask to you, Frederick, how easy or how difficult is it from your perspective that you have in the MICAT project, which is Horizon 2020 project, to assess these multiple impacts and to integrate them into the results about energy efficiency potentials and to make this comparison between demand side and supply side investments more comprehensive, more complete?
Well, first of all, I want to say the photo, that wasn't me before. And to your question, so basically the issue we're seeing when we are quantifying those multiple impacts is that the robustness and the accuracy of those results strongly depend on the data source we have. And since our project doesn't only address the EU level and the national level, but also the local level, we see like a wide range of different accuracy regarding different indicators. And what we're also facing now is this kind of turnaround, because for a long time, multiple impacts were a thing that were assessed in hindsight. So 5 years later, people were saying, well, basically that was a good idea because it turns out it had these kind of multiple impacts. And now we're trying to bring those multiple impacts into the impact assessment before measures are implemented. And that is kind of a turnaround. And we see this, this effect where we have things we assessed in the past as correlations. And now we have to ask ourselves, are those just correlations or are there causalities lying underneath? And so we have this kind of issues where we have to see if that really works. But in the end, whether we have really accurate results or not, the scale of those multiple impacts is often far beyond the energy cost savings that are assessed in the first place and that are taken into account when many decisions are taken. So overall, we still see that the multiple impacts, whether we're gonna assess them really precisely or not, have a significant impact on the overall, on the overall competitiveness and cost effectiveness of these measures. So really, yeah, the whole thing can be a significant impact on the scale between supply side and demand side measures.
Thank you, Frederick. Another question to you. We are now in a context where we see that some of the multiple benefits, notably supply security, come high on the agenda, and we see impacts of choices there, for example, on GDP evolution, on prices, and so on. All these kind of impacts where we can put some cost on now. But from a European or national perspective, do you think that the data on multiple impacts can make a difference when comparing the scenarios and discussing what should be prioritized? I mean, Tim, he showed the system perspective and he made some hints, let's say, and we can have some hypothesis how different that could be in terms of outcome. But maybe you can, from your present view, give some insights.
Well, first of all, I hope so, because my work would feel kind of futile if it didn't. But overall, we see, on one hand, we see the scale of those impacts that is really significant and can really change the cost effectiveness. But also, what we often see is that the decisions in the past were often taken by guts. So we didn't really have those fact-based decisions, and they were often influenced by factors that now actually we do address in the multiple impact approach. So for instance, when we look at the coal phase out in Germany, or lignite to be exact, that has been delayed for quite a while, just for 15,000 workers. And in contrast, the renewable industry has been led to decline basically because of this decision. So those 15,000 workers, that is something actually we address because we look at employment effects within this framework. So really we can address those policy issues and policy fields that often are more dear to the policymakers than actually the facts themselves. And so I really think that this can have an impact because it also addresses those sentiments that also lead to decision making beyond the facts. So yeah.
Thank you, Frederick. So let's move on then to our next panelist, Sebastian Batzler. He is, he was, I must say now, with the Technical University of Munich, and as a Bavarian, I'm proud to say you work now for the Bavarian Research Alliances, and you have been heading the ERA data project, which also made important contributions to the multiple benefits Horizon, another Horizon 2020 project. And the question or the challenge is how the data and knowledge from our assessments could be made available to decision makers. And in your project, the ERA data project, you have been working with the local authorities. Question to you, when you were bringing to them these questions about investments in their public buildings and the benefits they have, what was the feedback from these authorities you have been working with? Did they have interest in getting more information about the impacts, about the tools that you have been developing and how they can use it in practice?
Thank you, Wolfgang. So maybe first I would sketch in one sentence what we actually did in ERA-Data. So we developed a software solution and methodologies to quantify wider benefits like mostly indoor climate, life, CO2 emissions and environmental impacts, as well as socioeconomic impacts like job creation, together in one solution that should be used by municipalities to assess their building stock on a building level. But just to give you a short overview. So for the feedback, it is very interesting because we have 3 practical partners in the project, which is the city of Copenhagen, the city of Villena in Slovenia, and the region of Andalusia in Spain, to cover all kind of different climate and cultural backgrounds. And I need to say the feedback was different from all of them. The expectations were different from all of them. And what we learned most is that each of them had different goals and different processes. They were used to different tools, to different analysis. So I think it was really hard to find out what we actually want to give to them that they can work with. And I would just give a brief example. For example, the Spanish entities, they were only interested in the database, and they will love to see the facts that we create with the tool to detach and decouple their decisions from the political decisions. So they were very aware that they want to get away from political driven decisions. They wanted to have the fact base to put new arguments on the table for energy efficiency. Whilst the smaller municipality, for example, in Villena in Slovenia, they were happy to have a tool for pre-assessment. So they wanted to use it to sketch the potential of their building stock before they go to an external consultant. So they used it completely different, and they had a completely different expectation. Whilst in Copenhagen, where they have already quite established solutions, they loved the opportunity to bring everything together. And they were looking forward to integrate certain modules into their assessment. So they, for example, were focusing a lot into the indoor climate module, because then they could couple it with flexigrids and all the new solutions they have. So kind of everyone took a part out of it. And this was also the feedback that we got. And then the final thing, we already spoke about it this morning. So the feedback we received after finishing the project was that I think they had hard times to use these tools practically directly in the daily work. So they would use the database that we created. They learned how to communicate more with the departments. I think this was the main outcome for them, was to combine data that they had, because there was a lot of data available. I was surprised from the Andalusian Energy Agency what they already had on data. They had even indoor climate measurements they didn't know about, because they had it in some schools that were lying around. And in the project, they started to collect this data, to combine it with the databases they had. They came up with completely new databases. So I think this was the main output for them. And for the others was really to, like Villena, we analyzed each of their buildings, because they only have 25 public buildings. So it was a kind of a good task to just go through all these buildings and assess them. So they were happy to have this pre-assessment, to know how much potential in the indoor climate has, how much potential they have with productivity increases. So for them, it was kind of a huge political argument, more than the tool itself. And for Copenhagen, as I said, I think it's the same thing. They had new topics they had on the table, because we put like job creation, we put taxation as a topic. We had the life cycle assessment, which they also wanted to integrate in their work and planning process, but they didn't know how to. So we could offer solutions, and they were happy with it. But I think everyone took a little bit of the cake and made something different out of it. So the practical use of the tool we will see in the next months. We deployed it as an installable device, so you can actually download it and install it on your local computer and feed it with your own data. So if any one of you is interested, you can also try it out. It's a standalone software. But yeah, we will see what they bring.
Thank you. Partly you already touched or answered a second question I have from these case studies. What type of impacts are the most important one? Well, most naturally, supply security may not be the major focus at the local level, while you touched upon the indoor climate, also productivity changes, but maybe you can underline that in particular. Do you think that through that way we can promote the energy efficiency first principle, which is now, or hopefully will be now, enshrined in Article 3 of the Energy Efficiency Directive? How can we factor that in and answer better with these multiple benefits?
I need to say I was surprised of the positive attitude towards all these benefits, because I was thinking in the beginning it's a very abstract concept, like providing jobs or regional economy, all these things, productivity. And I thought that they are not that interested. I think they thought they would just look at this like financial quantified factors. But in the end, I think this is a chance for energy efficiency to diversify kind of the output, the impact. And then all these municipalities can actually take what they want. Because every of these entities we were working with, they had other expectations, as I said. For example, for the Danish colleagues, the indoor climate was very important. I think also because they are strong in indoor climate, but also this like the productivity increases. I think they took these results very clearly as their favorite output. And also taking like energy efficiency, having all these kind of spectrum of impacts. And for example, the Spanish colleagues, they were very interested in the job creation because of the unemployment situation in Andalusia. So it's kind of always the background they bring in, their political goals they bring in, and then they want to take the energy efficiency outputs in a way that they can solve their issues or tackle their issues. For Vilenia, it was very interesting because they are coal dependent. There's a huge coal mine in the city, and they are afraid of the future, what will come next. So they were very interested in these energy security measures. And also very much interested in the job creation effects. So I think depending on the background, they took these very specific topics and made them for them as a huge topic. And I think for us, it was a good way to communicate energy efficiency, because it got away. They are also bored by this very simple energy efficiency. Okay, we need to reach this energy efficiency targets. And this is what the only thing we have on the table. We don't have more arguments for the building. And now they had suddenly a few arguments that were in line with their issues. And I think this was at least triggering a really interesting political discussion also within the municipality, within the council, to drive a decision towards energy efficiency. I think this was nice to see, actually.
Yeah. So the process, in fact, matters as much as being able to apply the tools. Thank you very much. We need to move on to our next panelist, Bianca Joai-Tehrani. She is a senior economist at the French electricity transmission system operator, RTE, and you had already contacts with the Enefirst project where you presented a combined study between RTE and ADEME about the impacts of building retrofits and the electrification of heating systems on the overall electricity system, and that was published last year. So very interesting inputs also for the energy efficiency first discussion. Now, as a transmission system operator, let's say RTE, it's very interesting to reflect how the energy efficiency first principle is going to change maybe your thinkings, your planning processes. So about your planning process, how are possible changes on the demand side assessed? And what kind of stakeholders and consultations does this evolve presently?
Yes. I don't know, is it working? Yes.
It works, yeah.
So RTE, as the French TSO, is the owner of this big grid in France, and has the legal responsibility for ensuring security of supply at every instant, at every second, actually. So that's why we are, of course, it's part of our missions to try to assess how demand will change, whether it's tomorrow or in 30 years. So in our long-term studies, we had this study on building retrofit, and also an even bigger study on energy futures to 2050 that was published in October, and then complete report in February. We did projections to 2050 of both the evolution of demand and the whole electricity system supply and transmission, etc. And in this role, we really have to take into account several consumption scenarios that could happen, including energy efficiency, but also failures of energy efficiency targets. So for this, we had a very large public consultation. It involved 120 organizations. So it's like major public companies, but also NGOs like Negawatt, public bodies like ADEME, in order to shape our scenarios. It means really key discussions to shape our scenarios with the most interesting risks for the future to take into account. So yes, very big consultation, and that's for the long term. And for the short term, we also need to take into account demand side resources, demand response. And that means that we have to change market rules so that for all the flexibility mechanisms that we have to operate and activate every day, every hour, consumers that want to provide demand response could be, so that they can be able to offer that service just like a power plant. So that's another aspect of taking into account, so the demand resource aspect. So I mean, in link with Energy First principle.
Thanks a lot, Bianca, for these insights. I mean, you touched upon a very interesting point, which is about targets at the policy level and possible failures of the targets. I mean, you are responsible in a way for grids to operate, and if our policies fail, for you, it raises additional difficulty how to propose a stable grid over time. So target achievement is very important. Now, do you see already, when it comes to this integration of demand side resources, both with respect to energy efficiency and demand response measures which enhance flexibility, do you see changes in the way this is taken already into account and in the decision-making process afterwards, where possibly there are differences with respect to previous approaches, where there is less investment necessary, for example, in grid enhancement, than would have been otherwise if the energy efficiency first principle would not have been explicitly figured into the considerations?
Yes, so the first step, I would say, is that first, we integrate demand response in our system, in all the mechanisms that already exist, so that they can offer their capacity. And that allows us to see for the future whether in that case, or that when the situation is tense, whether we can just use a flexibility from the consumers, or whether we have to reinforce or not. So yes, there is for our future investments, there is always this question of economically studying whether flexibility is available, or whether we need maybe reinforcing this line or not. Yes, so it's really integrated in our plans.
Thanks, Bianca, for these very interesting insights. Now, moving on to our last but not least panelist, Maria Galavan. She is with she's a senior energy modeling specialist at Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. Maria, you are online. I hope you can hear us well. You took part in a recent Ireland's national heat study, which provided very interesting examples of a comprehensive assessment of the options available to decarbonize Ireland's energy used for the heating and cooling of homes, businesses, and industry. So question to you, when you were comparing the different options or strategies for buildings, did the study assess them from the viewpoint of building owners or from the society as a whole, or both perhaps? And did you find differences in the perspectives, let's say, or a gap in these two perspectives between individual and societal perspective when you did your study or your analysis?
Yeah,
Maria, can you hear me?
Yes,
yeah.
I can hear. I hope you can all hear me. So yeah, thanks. As you mentioned, we recently undertook a national heat study. It's considered a number of scenarios to get to net zero by 2050. I might just give a quick overview of those scenarios before I address your question. We had a baseline scenario, which was just business as usual. And so we knew before we started that wasn't going to get anywhere near net zero. Then we looked at a decarbonized gas scenario. So in this scenario, government policy really supported the expansion of the gas grid. We had implementation of carbon capture and storage for the power sector and in industry. We had production of green hydrogen, and we also looked at maximizing additional resources from anaerobic digestion. And in this scenario, there were low levels of heat networks deployment and low levels of energy efficiency uptake. The next scenario was then sort of a complete opposite to that. We looked at a high electrification scenario where there was a lot of support for heat pumps alongside uptake of energy efficiency and high levels of district heating. The third scenario is then the balance between the decarbonized gas and the high electrification, as we sort of saw like a medium level of heat networks and energy efficiency. And then the last scenario that we looked at was a rapid progress scenario, and that was really where we modeled like an immediate ramp up of a lot of diverse policies, but really focusing on technologies that were available now in the short term. So I guess we used archetype modeling to model buildings, and as you mentioned as well, we considered industrial sites. So I guess to answer your question, that enabled us to consider the options from a building level, but then also to aggregate things up and look at it from a societal perspective. So I guess we looked at both perspectives, and we didn't really find a gap, much difference between both perspectives. And I guess the main things that we found were that in terms of like the consumers, the buildings, the decarbonized gas scenario saw the highest fuel costs overall, because hydrogen is obviously an expensive fuel, and both the infrastructure and the production is expensive, and those costs would be passed on to consumers. We found that scenarios that involve switching to heat pumps saw lower retail fuel costs overall, because of the heat pump efficiency and also some energy efficiency measures, fabric measures being implemented to make heat pumps suitable. I should say, I guess, that we don't really have district heating at the moment in Ireland. There's only a few very small pilot schemes, so that we did see kind of uptake of district heating in some of our scenarios. Also, I guess we saw differences between sectors. So for example, in the residential sector, we found that in all the scenarios, there were lower average fuel costs compared to the baseline. And particularly in the residential sector, there's a lot of homes in Ireland which are detached rural homes that have oil boilers, so they can reduce their heating costs by largely switching to heat pumps. And for them, it's really the upfront cost of changing their heating system that's the barrier to them, and that's where they need the support. However, for the industry sector, we saw the opposite. So there, it was easier for them to have the upfront capital available to switch heating system. But we found that at the moment, the industry sector is very much focused on gas. So when they were switching to renewable options, they actually tended to have higher ongoing fuel costs. So I guess then when we looked at it from a societal point of view, we carried out a cost-benefit analysis, and we allowed for things like the shadow price of carbon, damage costs of other pollutants, and upstream emissions from bioenergy. And so I could guess similar to the consumer perspective, we found that the decarbonized gas scenario was the most costly from the economic perspective. The high electrification scenario was the least expensive. And interestingly, I guess we probably maybe thought in advance that the rapid progress scenario would be the most costly because, you know, we'd front loaded a lot of the capital expenditure, but we actually found that that came out with similar costs to the balanced scenario, largely because we were reducing the emissions more quickly. So we have the lowest cumulative emissions in that scenario, and therefore the cost of carbon was actually lower in that scenario. So yeah, I guess I suppose overall, we didn't really find conflict between the two perspectives.
Before opening up to the general public, a last question, a bit provocative to you, Maria. Ireland has implemented a fabric first, so envelope first approach in some of its incentives, and now in your study and also what you're saying, there can be trade-offs necessary between a rapid decarbonization on one hand and a longer-term effect. We know that from other measures in the past, but how is your feeling about these trade-offs? Is it possible with these trade-offs to implement the energy efficiency first principle, for which we know there are sometimes very long time periods before things can be active? We heard it from Tim that some of the benefits arise beyond 2030 and not in the next 1 or 2 years, at least only partially. Maybe you can briefly still comment on that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so yeah, you're right that we have adopted a fabric first approach in most of our support schemes here to date. But I guess maybe just to point out, I guess the heat study was developed in the context of Ireland's climate action legislation. So we now have a legal requirement for greenhouse gas emissions to be 51% lower in 2030 than they were in 2018, and to get to carbon neutral by 2050. And we also have carbon budgets for both the first and the second half of this decade, and work is ongoing at the moment to set sectoral emissions ceilings. So I guess we're not just operating sort of in an energy efficiency environment anymore. We have these carbon budgets, which kind of changes the game for our goals. And so the modeling work clearly showed that if we want to try to stay within these carbon budgets and meet, you know, the 2030 targets, we really need an early effort to reduce the total cumulative emissions. So I guess we found that against this backdrop, that the study found that the fabric first approach doesn't seem to be consistent with meeting those goals. And yeah, that is a little bit controversial. We found, I suppose, that the fabric first was also not financially viable for a lot of consumers in the analysis. And like a lot of we found very high levels of government support will be needed to drive additional uptake of energy efficiency measures beyond what's already been done. And we found that, I guess, support schemes that supported, you know, some fabric improvement, you know, enough to enable a switch to a renewable heating system. Those sort of support schemes were likely to see more uptake and I guess, require less state investment overall. I kind of mentioned that we don't have district heating in Ireland at the moment. To any great degree. So we did find, I guess, that there's quite a lot of potential exists to switch a lot of buildings onto a district heating network that would use either waste heat or renewable heating from heat pumps. So I guess for those I suppose switching those, you know, quickly in this decade to to a district heating system would sort of quickly reduce emissions, but it won't necessarily reduce the heating demand of those buildings. But certainly, I guess we will see trade-offs coming down the line in meeting, you know, our targets under the energy efficiency directive.
Thanks a lot, Maria. I resist boldly a temptation to open another parenthesis, but would rather like to open for a few minutes still to questions from the public. I'm not sure about online, but let's first start maybe here giving priority in case there are immediate reactions, immediate questions to what you heard in the panel. No hands are raised. Yes. Background.
Now it works. Hi, I'm Dirk Salens from KU Leuven, Energyville. And I have a more general question on the implementation of all the technologies and all the measures that are taken. So they also cost a lot of energy. So to what extent would including the energy that is needed to implement all the technologies and the measures influence the results that you have?
Thanks a lot. Who from the panelists would like? Sorry, who from the panelists would like to take this question? Brian, I was sure, yeah, you were going to jump on this.
Well, in general, I think there's it's always a question that we get this life cycle perspective, which is important, especially if we have a decarbonized system. We have to think about what kind of materials we use. But in general, the modeling results and those balances that we find are similar to what we would find upstream, and the upstream emissions are much smaller than what we see here. So just an example, a wind turbine today is paid back within 3 months energy wise, just to put things into a bit of perspective.
Maybe Martin, you also want to jump on this?
Can I just add to that?
Oh, sorry,
Maybe,
excuse me.
Sorry, Wolfgang,
your priority,
just add to that from the building perspective, because I think also it's a very valid point. And also this, I think the last 15 years was like sensor driven, I would say, but I feel like there's a switch to more like simple buildings again that do the same things that were done before with the sensors. And also when I look into like the life cycle assessment, also like maintenance is something is very overseen, I have this feeling, and it's a huge driver to save energy and to also maintain buildings longer. I was just talking to Professor Lang, my old boss at the Technical University of Munich, and they were thinking of extending the life cycle assessment period to 100 years instead of 50, just to think a little bit different. So in this way, in this regard. Yeah, just to add that.
Thanks, Sebastian. Martin, you also wanted to come in at that point?
Yeah. Maybe just to complement, I think in retrofits of buildings, we are safe of using materials because you're offsetting really the effect by large. But of course, there is also, as it is in the insulation thickness of energy efficiency, a certain limit. But you actually you reach the marginal cost of too high energy efficiency measures first before you would reach actually the marginal cost of environmental impact. It's a bit different in case of new buildings. So there you start from a lower level, and in a new building, really the embodied emissions can have a substantial part of the whole life cycle emissions of buildings, and so we are all the guys from the building sectors are asked for really put more emphasis on this, and I think also in the legislation, and this is only starting, and I think there is a certain potential, although it's of course not so much of a quick gain as retrofitting buildings, but I think that should be like the next level of whatever maps and stuff.
Thanks, Martin. Do we have first here or online?
Okay, I would have one more for Maria, as I'm not sure that you will stay with us this afternoon, so I take the opportunity right now. So you mentioned the fact that the fabric frost approach is not most probably in most cases affordable or cost effective for the building owner. But at the same time, if I remember well, one of the results from your study is that it shows as well that if you change first the heating system, then it makes even less cost effective to do insulation later on. So do you see any risk of lock-in effect, or let's say missed opportunities? Maybe not now, but later on when you need to grab the further energy savings.
Yes, I think you're correct. Yeah, absolutely. If I guess we were kind of focusing on trying to reduce emissions as quickly as possible. So I guess if the government supports are available, to install a heat pump now, in this decade, it's unlikely that government supports will be available in later years to assist those homes to become more energy efficient. So I guess that's sort of the trade-off that has to be considered. You know, we haven't changed our support schemes so far, you know, as a result of the heat study. We're still supporting energy efficiency measures. We are looking more into, there's a lot of research going on around the district heating piece, and to see if that's something that we can ramp up quickly. But yeah, no, I absolutely take your point, and I agree with it. But I guess there's a finite amount of government support available. So I guess it's just trying to figure out what's the best way to use that.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I was hoping that you're going to open this parenthesis. I mean, there is a nice other example from the British when they introduced the energy saving obligations, and where in fact the insulation measures which were taken were concavity wall, which was very easy to do and very cheap, but not, let's say, in a long-term perspective, the most efficient. So in a way, when it came to deep renovation, it was already over for 1 million of buildings, let's say. So this question, this trade-off is really an important one. You still wanted to react? No, Sebastian, no, it's good. Okay, time is running. I'm now under control about the overall coordinators, so we should close down. I get the signal here, so let us thank very cordially to all our guests here and for the discussion. So let's give them up an applause. Thanks to all for participating in this debate here, and I think there are many more interesting questions to come. And this afternoon, with that, I hand over to Jean-Sebastian. You still have an announcement to make for this afternoon?
No, I thank you for surviving until then, and now we deliver you, and you can go to lunch downstairs, and we'll come back here at 2:15. So thanks a lot for attending this morning, and we hope you will join us also this afternoon for the policy part of the day. And as Wolfgang says, thanks again to all our panelists and for your time. It was very interesting. Thanks.